Morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the NTU-SBF Center for African Studies Visiting Speakers Series. My name is Mark, and on behalf of the Singapore Business Federation, we would like to welcome you. Without further ado, it is now my pleasure to invite Mr. Johan Berger, Director of the NTU-SBF Center for African Studies, to give his welcome remarks. Johan, please.
Thank you, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Director of the Center. It really is my pleasure to welcome you all to this event this morning. We were quite fortunate. Dr. Mills contacted me a month ago and he said, Johan, I am in Singapore. What are the chances that we have something like this? And my immediate response of quite a number of people were that, Johan, it's Chinese New Year, you're taking the risk. So I'm delighted that all of you have braved the Chinese New Year conditions leading up to it to be here today. Ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce our honored guests to you, allow me to make a few observations on Africa, kind of set the scene. I pasted a book and I took out all the nice statistics and stories so that Greg and Jeffrey do not have to look at them. I'm only teasing. Ladies and gentlemen, if we have a look at the past year or two, there are a couple of trends that we need to bear in mind when we do look at Africa. An important one is the issue of urbanization, where we find an increasing number of people in Africa moving towards the cities in the hope of finding jobs, housing, etc. And while urbanization is generally equated with economic development, we also find a couple of negatives. A lack of housing, a lack of services, and so we can go on. So we frequently find, unfortunately, slum conditions, because cities are not planned, they happen. There are exceptions, and we need to take these exceptions and make them kind of the benchmark. We also see a growing number of youth moving to the cities, and they are either a demographic dividend, if we were to look at them being employed and being the future, or they're going to become a demographic disaster. I think that Jeffrey and Greg will touch upon that, so I'm not going to say anything more other than 60% of the unemployed in Africa are said to be in this youth group. So education is going to be a strong issue. We find a growing number of consumers that we are finding. Some people talk about a middle class, others say no, you can't talk about a middle class, the numbers are not right, or the sort of parameters which falls into the middle class are not right. Be it as it may, I do believe that the concept of a consumer class is valid, and it goes with a strong growth in Africa's population. By 2050, it was said that we would have about 2.4 billion people in Africa. By the year 2100, we're looking at over 4 billion. This creates a lot of potential. It also creates a lot of challenges. In terms of the democracy, ladies and gentlemen, we find a mixed bag. There's some good news, but we also see signs that are a source of concern. We recently found in the election in Kenya, where the deputy president spoke about that Kenya now needs a benevolent dictator. The idea is that that would lead to economic prosperity, and that can be a very dangerous issue. We find that China and other countries from the East are moving in a greater degree into Africa. And we have also the emergence of both the BRI and the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, creating interesting discussions, interesting dilemmas in a certain way for Africa as to who they would be supporting. Calls to industrialize the economy of Africa have come thick and fast. The rise of fintech, probably one of the miracle stories of Africa. Financial technology or fintech and mobile technology. M-Pesa, M-Kopa, M-Akiba, if there's an M in front there, something will come with it. So it is really a great story, and it's increasing the number of the financial included people in Africa in vast numbers. The growing importance of sectors of the economies of Africa, and this I stole from the book, mining, agriculture, manufacturing, services, infrastructure, planning and delivery. The retail space, personally for me, also a very interesting space with global players moving into Africa and Africa's own players also moving into the rest of Africa. A lot of South African retail players looking at Africa at large. East Africa becoming a very interesting place where some of the larger players, internal players, are picking up problems. You've probably read about Nakumatt, those of you who are favoured with Kenya in that regard. There's been also a call for the diversification of economies away from an overemphasis on commodities and the export of raw commodities. Hopefully they have and will be using the time ahead to diversify the economies, moving into agriculture, manufacturing, amongst others also the field of textiles. I'm seeing His Excellency Kabaruganda from Rwanda here. And Rwanda is one of the countries then also doing its utmost to get a diversified economy up and running. Energy, ladies and gentlemen, there's been a lot of renewable energy focus. And then the last one, Africa tilting from West Africa, investments from West Africa into East Africa. And in spite of all of this, ladies and gentlemen, and probably because of many of this, Africa presents many opportunities. In terms of economic growth, 6 of the top 10 global players projected for 2018 are from Africa. Ghana is number 1 at 8.2%. 2 years ago, they were 3.6%. Looking at Ethiopia, it's second in the world at 8%. You're looking at Cote d'Ivoire at 7.2%, at 4th. Djibouti 5th at 7%. You're looking at Tanzania, or Senegal rather, 8th at 6.9%, and Tanzania at 9th at 6.8%. So that's not shabby for a continent that was initially the Africa rising, picked up a bubble with the decline in growth from China and the drop in the end of the commodity price super cycle. Tapping into these opportunities, ladies and gentlemen, in a sustainable manner is dependent on a number of factors. These factors and the delivery of them is the essence of the book, Making Africa Work. We are fortunate to have 2 of the 4 authors with us today, Dr. Greg Mills and Dr. Jeffrey Herbst. Dr. Mills is the director of the Brenthurst Foundation with its head office in Johannesburg. Not everybody can live in Singapore or in Cape Town. Whereas Dr. Herbst is a member of the advisory board of the foundation, and he is in the USA. Both are scholars of Africa. Both are accomplished authors. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming both Greg and Herbst to Singapore. And I'll now hand over to Greg.
Thank you very much, Jehan. It's a great pleasure to be here. Back in Singapore, I did a fellowship at RSIS at the Rajaratnam School a couple of years ago with my family, which I greatly enjoyed. And it's always a pleasure to return here and enjoy some of the sights and sounds and culinary treats of Singapore. And especially a pleasure to be here at the Center of African Studies, which was an idea just talked about when I was here last for any considerable length of time. And to visit with my friend and colleague and co-author Jeffrey Herbst as well. This book has its genesis in the work of the Brenthurst Foundation, which was established in 2005 by the Oppenheimer family, well known for their involvement in the mining sector throughout Africa. And over the last 12 years, we've learned a great deal about advisory work across the continent. About 2/3 of our time is spent advising African governments at their request. It's a demand-driven pro bono consultancy, if I could describe it as such. And we provide development strategies, reform strategies for governments, sometimes on secondment. I spent a year working as the strategy advisor to the president of Rwanda, modeling what became the Rwandan Development Board, for example. And most recently, we've spent a lot of time in Nigeria. In fact, I was there just 10 days ago. We're working with the Lagos state government. And last year, our major project was with the government of Ghana in developing a reform strategy for Ghana to get it out of this continuous cycle of boom and bust, which has characterized that economy over the last 60 years of its independence. A lot of these learnings we thought would be wasted, that we have learnt as an institution, if we didn't put them down on paper. what we have learnt about how to reform economies, about translating good ideas into practical experience, that all forms really the part of this book, and is the motivation behind this book, is trying to encapsulate those lessons both for Africa but also for those attempting to seek change across the continent, and that's really the motive behind this book. We're also looking ahead, as Johan has said, about what is the nature of the continent in the future, what are the big challenges, what does an end to business as usual look like for the continent as we project ahead over the next generation, because rather like Singapore has done, we should be planning with that sort of length of time in front of us rather than simply trying to plan for tomorrow or for the electoral term of the latest government. But before I get into the specifics of the book, let me ask everybody here, is how many people have been to Africa in this audience? So about half of you. How many of people here have done business in Africa or are doing business in Africa? So just a handful of you. And may I ask, has anybody here been to any country other than South Africa? Okay, so a fair sprinkling. The direct air flight has some benefits, but clearly it's not the ultimate determinant in this regard. So I'm speaking to then an audience which is pretty knowledgeable about the continent. We can talk a little bit later, and indeed my colleague Jeffrey Herbst will talk about sectors and specific countries and specific challenges, and this is a two-part thus presentation in this regard. And what I will do is I'll sketch out some of the big general themes in this book which motivated its writing. And let me just add before I start that we are actually here to research the successor to this book, or the sequel to this book, which is provisionally entitled Making Democracy Work, as a rejoinder to your point about what Africa needs is another big man. What we are interested in is how to deepen various forms of democratization at multiple levels across the continent, and we've just been in Taiwan for a week talking about their democratic experience, and we're here in Singapore understanding your own evolution and role of representative government in your own economic success, because Singapore, which forms part of this book, is very much regarded as a standout model to be emulated, or at least to be aspired to by many across Africa. So this book came out 6 months ago. It's been published in a variety of languages so far and a variety of settings. You will know that one of the co-authors is the chairman of the advisory board of the foundation, President Olusegun Obasanjo, three-time former president of Nigeria. And of course it's then gained, as a result of him mainly, not us, Jeffrey, I'm afraid, a lot of international publicity and exposure on Hard Talk and Christian Amanpour and among other things. So it's been fairly popularly received, at least. I won't say well, that would be too pejorative. And been published in a variety of languages, including Arabic and in French, across a number of different settings, and indeed will be coming out shortly in Vietnamese in collaboration with the Center of African Studies in Hanoi, and also in Chinese, working with a Chinese publisher out of Beijing. The big themes that run across this book are, as Johan has already said, one first of demographic change, and I will come to that point in a moment. We argue that this issue of demography is the single biggest driver changing or demanding a need to changing business as usual across Africa. We can't simply keep going at doing what we did before, making a plan at relatively low rates of growth, dependent on commodity production mainly, and vulnerable to external price swings, without, in the face of such a tremendous demographic change, as the continent goes from roughly 1 billion people today to 2 billion people by the year 2050. In this, there's a whole variety of other changes. The majority of that extra billion people are going to be based in African cities, about 80% of that increase, as Johan has already said. Absent proper management and organization and planning, density and connectivity, this is a portent for demographic disaster and urban failure. With the right sets of planning and management in place, it could portend all sorts of opportunities and provide something of a demographic dividend. We also argue that it's not simply enough, as I've already alluded to, for Africa to rely on commodity price increases. In fact, what we learned, a lot of people said the big boom in African growth in the early 2000s, roughly between 2005 and 2015, was a result mainly of governance improvements. But actually what it turned out was a lot of that growth was down to commodity prices. And as commodity prices fell, to use the famous expression by Warren Buffett, as the tide went out, a lot of people were found to be swimming naked. It was much less due to governance and diversification than it was simply a rise, particularly in base metal prices. And what we need to do in Africa, and this again motivated this book, and in creating the need for jobs across the continent, as Johan has spoken about, was to diversify our economies and to put the conditions in place that allow for such a diversification to occur. We just carefully disaggregated the book across different sectors, which Jeffrey will speak about: mining, finance, tourism, manufacturing, technology, services, and so on, in trying to understand rather the specifics of sector-by-sector interventions rather than coming up with further generalizations on the African economy. And also, because many countries have national policy, development plans, national visions, there's scarcely an African country without a vision. We were less interested in this book in restating those visions and aspirations, in actually understanding what it takes to go from vision and plan and development aspiration to actual effects on the ground. And we spent a lot of time trying to understand why it is that development plans fail, because usually they're pretty good pieces of analysis. But why do they fail, and why do they never go from the planning stage into the actual implementation and execution phase? So, as has already been indicated, Africa is going to change a great deal as the world's population goes from 7 billion to about 12 billion, just under 12 billion by the year 2100. Africa's population is going to go from around 1 billion today to 4 billion over the next 85 years, or 80 years and a bit. But particularly this change from 1 to 2 billion between now and 2050. To a great extent, if I can just use this, to a great extent, the African increase is going to be responsible for the big increase globally. It's not just about absolute numbers of people, which is the purple line here, somewhat indistinct, the purple line here, but it's also about the urban population, which is going to go through being a majority rural continent to being a majority urban continent by the year 2025. And that's going to change a great deal of policy planning emphasis, but also arguably a great deal of political emphasis, because previously if you were intent on capturing political support, you spent a lot of time in the rural areas in most African countries. That's going to change, but it also means that urban populations, well organized, particularly through handheld devices, can quickly become a political force and be mobilized accordingly, particularly among young people. As the urban population is going to increase to about 1.3 billion people by 2050, from current levels of just over 400 million, providing tremendous opportunity in terms of economies of scale, tremendous opportunity in terms of infrastructure, tremendous opportunity in terms of the densification of markets, transportation of people. But to do all of that, as you know only too well, in Singapore, and yesterday we had lunch at the Singapore Cricket Club, and we were shown a picture by Professor Barry Desker, who's a longtime friend and collaborator, on the wall of the shoreline, which was basically outside the cricket pitch, 150 years ago. And it just shows the extent to which the city of Singapore has changed. I did rudely say in his lifetime, but he's not 150 years old. But it's changed in many of your lifetimes, and just to look at Marina Bay is evidence of this long-term planning cycle that Singapore is continuously undergoing. And that would have to be the case too in Africa, is imagining and envisaging the sorts of environments that will cope with this number of people. We spent time in Curitiba, and a lot of this book is about matching international best practice examples with African case studies. And we spent time in Curitiba understanding, which is the home of the BRT, the Bus Rapid Transport System, and went to go and see Jaime Lerner, who's seen as the father of the BRT, and understanding why it is that BRTs work in some places but don't work across all the 300 cities, many of which are in Africa, where there are BRTs. And it comes down ultimately to moving people from highly dense areas to other highly dense areas and planning accordingly. So that's some of the things we have to do. There's tremendous opportunities inherent in this. Africa's population is going to be around 20 years old over this period, and compared to the world population, which is aging. But this does place enormous pressures on the need for job creation. The IMF already says that we have to create 18 million high-value jobs across the continent annually, and that, of course, that figure is going to go up considerably as young people in increasing numbers come into the marketplace. And that, of course, places enormous emphasis, and I can't go into everything that's in the book here, I'm just going to touch on a few things. That places enormous emphasis on the need for education. And what happened in Africa in educational terms, and particularly in primary schooling, was that in 1970 about half of Africans had place in primary schools. So there was a huge emphasis put on just simply getting bums into seats during the ensuing 40 years, and we've done pretty well at that task. Sub-Saharan Africa's actual enrollment rates, sorry, this graph only starts in came from nothing at that point. The enrollment rates increased from 50% to over 100% in terms of place availability, but our completion rates remained around 60%, much lower than the global average, even at primary schooling levels. And this figure is much lower for girl scholars than it is for boys. So a lot of work still has to be done in primary schooling to get people from simply enrollment and enough place availability to completion and mastery. And that relates to all sorts of gender inequalities, conditions in which people find themselves, labor practices, and so on and so forth. And then if you look at this in terms of tertiary enrollment and skip through the secondary, well, we're way behind the global average here, and there's a huge amount of work to be done. If you look at it in terms of research and development in higher learning institutions, clearly there's a lot more work and a lot more money has to be applied. But of course, money is not everything in this regard. It's also about management and the systems in which people are placed, as we know only too well in South Africa, because we spend roughly a fifth of our budget on education and don't get the results for the money that we invest in it. There have been other very big changes in Africa which are driving change, which we acknowledge in the book, particularly mobile telecommunications. In 1995, Africa had about 10% of the telephony connectivity of the rest of the world. It caught up to where the rest of the world was in 2005, where the rest of the world was in 1995. So it went to 140 per 1,000 connections, and now it's pretty much on par with the global norm. A little bit below it, there's been widespread use of telephony, as Johan indicated, in terms of mobile transactional banking. I sit on the board of an investment fund. I've just spent some time in Tanzania looking at how we're going from transactional banking to more traditional type lending and borrowing with the creation of credit profiles using mobile telephony technology, and particularly the creation of a market space for smartphones And that is an ongoing revolution across the continent, and particularly as data rates come down, because they remain generally very high in Africa, as they come down, which they inevitably will do, these sorts of usages will go up. And this is certainly a transformative technology across the continent. But in other technologies, we're doing very badly, and they are more basic technologies, particularly in power. About 2/3 of our populations in Africa are without power. I mean, I remember living in Rwanda in 2008, up in the hills of Kigali with my very young family at the time. We had a generator. There was 55 megawatts of power in all of Rwanda at that time. I mean, it's now virtually doubled, but still 100 megawatts is very small for a population of 11 million people. I'm not sure how many megawatts Singapore has for its 5.5 million people, but I suspect it's many thousands of megawatts just by comparison. And it's very hard to get into diversification and transformation of basic raw commodities and create the sort of jobs that you need without this basic utility. And a lot of the work that we did in Ghana was trying to understand why people were not investing in this sector. And really, in many cases, it comes out the fact that the tariffs and the payment thereof in Ghana, as in Nigeria, are not matched. If you're not being paid for your electricity, it's hard to be able to invest in it. And that is a political issue, because by making people pay for it, of course, whether it's prepaid meters or businesses on different types of systems, it becomes highly politicized because it's seen almost as a tax on those who do pay and not on those who don't. But that's just one of the problems that they're faced in literally getting this most basic of technologies to the populations. And you see here, that's the global average. It's only South Africa that matches the global average. The rest of Africa is way below it in terms of access. And this has implications for learning, it has implications for healthcare, has all sorts of dramatic impacts, negative impacts on society. And this is why we have not invested, and we haven't got the rates of investment in basic technologies that East Asia has by comparison. And this is also why, in a vicious cycle, we haven't enjoyed the sort of growth rates that East Asia has done. And this is a very dramatic, should I turn the lights off here? Oh, how's that? No. Yes. These ones? There we go. I'm not just an academic, I can turn lights on and off. And if you look at Africa's economic history, sub-Saharan Africa's economic history, essentially there were three phases of growth. There was the early period from independence to about the mid-1970s. We grew to nearly $1,000 per capita in real terms. A lot of redistribution happened, a lot of transferal of ownership, relatively buoyant commodity prices, low oil prices, and then the oil shocks, plus a compounding effect of poor governance, military coups d'etats, bad rule, and so on, and a long period of decline bottoming out in the 1990s, and then only by 2010 getting back to where we were in the mid-1970s. And what does this basically mean, this from there to there, is we lost 40 years. While, guess what? Southeast Asia was doing that. And it's a pretty stark comparison. If you of course, put this on an index of Singapore, it was the same per capita income as Tanzania in 1959. We were reminded recently, and it's now at what, $50,000 per capita, roughly? Well, it's right off the charts here, so I wouldn't bother to do it. And there's lots of opportunity which we have not realized in the process. We have the largest store of arable land. We spend some time in the book talking about agricultural opportunities, how to realize them. I've spent far too much of my career pounding around farms in very remote areas. The basic problem is that 39 of 49 sub-Saharan African countries remain net agricultural importers of food, despite the fact that we have this great store of arable land. And the reasons why we know: it's lack of land title, inability to collateralize as a result of a land title obfuscation, lack of technology, lack of irrigation, lack of modern farming techniques. The paradox to all of that, and we spend some time again writing about this and researching this, is as you increase technologies in farming, particularly in cereal farming, of course, labor participation rates go down. So you've got this terrible bind that on the one hand you want to increase, on the other hand, as you go over to modern farming techniques, inevitably, not in every product of course, but inevitably, particularly in staples, employment goes down. But a lot can be done to change this picture of agricultural production, which means that the prices then, as you change this picture, become internally set rather than externally set, as is currently the case in much of Africa. And then finally, and this is a segue really to Jeffrey's work, we were challenged, we put this book up for review by a group of 30 or so academics, which is a terrible thing for another academic to do. We got a draft and we presented it to them, and then they spent 3 days shredding it and coming up with some very good comments. And I thought it was very bold of a former president to do that with his writings. I thought not many presidents are that without ego to be able to do that in a semi-public forum. And one of the things that people said to us is, you guys have to be clear about the relationship between democracy and development. You need to say whether it's in African experience, I'm not talking about East Asia here, but in the African experience, whether democracy and development go together, apropos of the comment that you made, Johan. And so we disaggregated the post-Cold War economic experience across sub-Saharan Africa, and we show very conclusively, and we've changed in Africa. There's sort of two periods of change in terms of democracy. There's sort of Cold War years where we had just two democracies as defined by Freedom House in terms of being in the free category, which were, anybody have an idea of two democracies in Africa in 1980? Come on, guess somebody. Diamonds, big Botswana, and
Liberia.
That well-known, no, Samuel Doe had upset that apple cart by then. Mauritius. And that moved very quickly to through the 1990s to more countries having multi-party elections, more countries moving into the free and not free categories, and then a second phase, which is the sort of regression, slow regression, as more countries move out of the free category into the partly free category, and we're more or less sort of flatlined in terms of democracy, as indeed we have in terms of governance improvement across the continent, and the two appear to be connected in this regard. So this was of concern to us when we disaggregated economic history over the last 25 years, and interestingly enough, we found this, is that the free countries are richer, they grow faster, the compounding effects of growth are much greater, not free does better, but if you strip out oil from not free, because many of the oil producers are not free, they do worse than the partly free category, and indeed pretty much flatline as well. But it's that category that we're interested in. So the better the democracy overall across Africa, and there are always exceptions to this rule. We spent time interviewing a number of different African leaders in this book, as we are doing in the next book. We have more than 25 African heads of government who we've interviewed for this next book. And here we also interviewed Haile Mariam Desalegn, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, because that's an exceptional case in terms of this categorization. They fall into very much into the not free category as defined by Freedom House. There are exceptions which we can talk about, but this is an important finding in an African context for this book. So if I was to end with a SWOT analysis, always a good thing to do on Africa, the strength is it's poor. There's lots of upside. It can grow quickly. When you're at $1,000 per capita, just the better application of allocation of capital and labor will make a very big difference. There's a very powerful commodity base, not least in my own country, South Africa, the largest in the world by any country's reckoning. We're in the same time zone as your big markets in Europe and the Middle East. We have a long-term democratic trajectory. Things since 1980, as I pointed out, are doing quite well. Mobile telecommunications has made a very big difference for us, and we speak a variety of languages and 3 main international languages in English, French, and Portuguese across much of the continent, reflecting our colonial history. Oops. The weaknesses are, of course, that we're poor, and that everything that goes with it. We're expensive because we're poor, and poor because we're expensive, and we're poor in terms of the educational allocations and healthcare allocations and just living conditions and the like. There's very opaque governance in many countries. That has not improved as fast as we would hope for. Because of our external dependency, we're locked into boom and bust cycles. The nature of the political economy is, to use a single term, very rent-seeking in its characteristics. It's not just boom and bust, highly dependent on external pricing, highly dependent on external supervision, but it's also tied in with very strong patrimonial patronage type linkages. There's a lack of value addition overall. I go back to the issue of a lack of electricity. And then the skills base is slowly improving, but not nearly improving, not nearly at a fast enough rate. The opportunities, of course, are that we have this very youthful population massing together in our cities over the next generation. There's relatively low growth elsewhere in the world. I mean, why put your money in an English bank account and get 0.1% interest if you're lucky, when you can seek higher returns in certainly the double digits, but maybe even over 15, 20% in Africa with the risk, but certainly much higher growth than elsewhere. And there's low population growth elsewhere, in fact, population decline elsewhere, which Africa doesn't experience. There remains demand for commodities, not least in China, which has driven up these prices. There are relatively low wages, although productivity challenges remain, and there's tremendous possibilities in terms of agro-industry as well. And then there are threats, which one has to be aware of. There are threats of demography. If you don't provide for this population, what happens? There's what I would call a Beijing consensus, that you have governments which are not challenged at the polls, in some cases, through either electoral management or processes. The comment again that Johan made, but so they're not competitive in a party political competitive sense, but that they can then run the country as they more or less like it, without fear of losing power, and that I think is a threat given our history. Our history in Africa is that unelected governments or uncompetitive governments don't achieve legitimacy through performance, which has been very much a feature of governments in this region. They're uncompetitive in every sense and unresponsive. Climate change does potentially have dramatic effects. I'm originally from Cape Town. It suffered the worst drought on record, which you've, I'm sure, all tuned into your television sets and see that my mother is now on 50 litres a day, among many others. And that's about planning for a change in climate as much as anything else, and adjusting usage. And a lot of that has to do with energy too, as you go to, in some places towards desalination and the energy needs that go with that. But it certainly does mean that in some cases, like the Sahel, potentially as they go from 170 million people to 350 million people over the next 35 years, plus throw in a bit of climate change, where are those people going to be moving to? At least to the littoral areas, but possibly north and south as well. Europe shutting its doors and making it much harder to move will create much more of a pressure cooker environment in many African countries. A careless America, not really interested in democratization, not really interested in wider developmental issues in Africa, is also a threat, I think, to our political economies. And then technology is also a threat, as I mentioned, in the farming sense, because as we move into a more laborless society, some of those avenues to growth that existed for you in the 1960s are not going to be open to all countries, and we'll have to find other ways to create jobs and make ourselves richer. So I'm going to let Jeffrey step in here and talk a little bit about countries and sectors.
Thanks, Johan, and a pleasure to be here. I've been to Singapore a couple of times over the last 10, 12 years, and the pleasure to be back and to address you. Greg talked about some of the continent-wide trends. Big continent with about 1.2 billion people if you include North Africa at the moment. So I thought I would get down a little more granular, and especially since I know that so many of you are involved in business and potentially looking to invest, perhaps, now or in the future in Africa, some of the considerations that you might think about in terms of investment. In terms of disaggregating Africa, how can we think about it? As Greg said, most countries in Africa have not executed on democratic performance yet. Most countries in Africa vote. In fact, almost all countries in Africa vote. In fact, a plurality of elections worldwide each year are held in Africa. Probably 10, 12 consequential national elections on the African continent each year. But if you look at how the systems actually work, we think that probably only about 10 of the 52 countries are democratic, not only in form, but in nature also. That means they not only have elections, but people vote in free and fair contests, and if the incumbent loses, he or she leaves. What's interesting about these 10 countries is that 6 of them are quite small. So of the democratic countries in Africa, we'd say that Benin, Botswana, Cape Verde, Mauritius, Namibia, and Sao Tome are democratic. Those range from small countries of about 5 million to Cape Verde, Sao Tome less than 500,000. So a disproportionate number of countries that are democratic are small. And of big countries, we see only Ghana, Senegal, South Africa, and Tunisia as democratic. And of those, only South Africa has a real demographic heft of about, 50 million now? So democratic performance is unusually concentrated in the smaller countries of Africa. And at the same time, if you look at the big countries of Africa, well, by population, they're Nigeria, 186 million, Ethiopia, 87 million, Egypt, 82 million, and Democratic Republic of the Congo, 69 million. That's about 425 million people of the 1.2 billion on the African continent. So exactly 4 countries contain 1/3 of the African population. That's very important to realize. There may be 52 countries, but exactly 4 of them have 1/3 of the people, and then there are a whole lot of countries that are very small. None of those 4 countries are considered democracies right now. They occasionally vote, as in Nigeria, had a relatively good election recently, but certainly Congo, Ethiopia, and Egypt, not democratic. So what you have is, if you looked and said, wow, Africa has 10 of 50 countries that are democratic, that's pretty good. But if you look at the percentage of people who are covered by democracy, it's actually quite small. And this matters in areas well beyond democracy. If you look at economic governance, we see in Africa, as Greg said, statistically, that there's a real correlation between democratic performance and economic performance. Not a complete correlation, as he also said. There are some democracies that have not done particularly well economically, although most have, and there are some non-democratic countries that have done well economically, although most have not. Why? Well, by and large in Africa, we have not seen benign authoritarians. That is, the authoritarians who rule in non-democratic countries do not have a long-term vision of a prosperous country which is highly inclusive. Rather, these authoritarian regimes tend to be extremely insecure, and they prop up their power by creating vast patron-client relationships, where government rewards through access, pay, bribes or the like, a significant number of people to support them. So the authoritarians may not be elected or may not worry about elections too much, but they're actually quite worried about their power, quite short-term in their perspective, and not actually investing in the country's long-term future, but rather investing in their own political survival till tomorrow. So we don't see a kind of benign authoritarianism, a kind of developmental state in most of the non-democratic countries in Africa. As a result, performance legitimacy, that is, governments that become more popular and more stable because of their economic performance, is often not a consideration in most African countries. It's who has direct access to the state and to power. There have been a lot of African leaders who have stayed in power for a long period of time who have not delivered economically, sometimes 20, 25, 30 years. Robert Mugabe, who was just deposed, as you know, in Zimbabwe a few months ago, or I'd argue Robert Mugabe's wife was just deposed a few months ago, was in power for 37 years, during a time in which he drove one of the economy's most potentially powerful, one of the continent's most potentially powerful economies, into the ground. Zimbabweans are poorer today than they were in 1980, yet he managed to stay in power. And that epitomized, to me, the disconnect between economic performance, if you like, and political survival. So performance legitimacy has not been a real concern in the authoritarian countries in Africa. Only true democracies have been able to hold leaders accountable. And finally, as you probably know, economic reform, usually promoted by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, has been a considerable issue in African countries really since the late 1980s, in terms of devaluing the currency, making sure that a government budget is sustainable, making sure that prices, whether they're paid to farmers or the like, are correct. In general, we find statistically, and then here's a rare social science finding, which I think is quite powerful and which I can communicate clearly, basically only new governments reform, okay? Old governments which have been in power for 25, 30 years, they don't change. I was just in Sudan, one of Africa's bigger countries, 42 million people, population, fairly big land size. The government of President al-Bashir has been in power 30 years. And now people again are saying, by the way, during which he had 15 agreements with the IMF. And people are now proposing new reforms for the Sudanese government. It's highly unlikely that that kind of government is going to change. Because once you've been in power for decades or more, you've developed certain avenues of support, certain patron-client relationships, and you can't just give those up and change to something else. So you need a system which promotes an alternation in power, and only democracy does that. So when you remove one government and a new government comes in, it's most likely to promote the difficult economic reforms that African countries need. And we see this when we look at the impact of government regulation on the economy. So some of you know the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, which measures how a wide variety of government regulations affect the economy, and they rank 180 countries in the world in terms of how constructive government intervention is in the economy. Singapore happens to be number 2 on that list, so you have some work to do. Hong Kong is number 1. But if you look at what the Heritage Foundation considers the economies that are free, that is, with relatively low unproductive government interference, or mostly free, the top 34 economies in the world, how many do you think are African? Of the top 34 countries that you would think about?
1 or 2?
One, and it's Mauritius. Okay, which does very well. Mauritius is basically tied with Chile and Malaysia in terms of its how its government operates in the economy. That's pretty good. That's pretty good company. But again, Mauritius is a small country of about 1.2 million people in an island way out from the coast of Africa. Many people in and outside of Africa don't even consider it an African country. Like the democracies, which tend to be small, small countries are easier to govern. They may not have as large, they don't have as large a population by definition, probably not as large a landmass, and their politics are simpler. And then if you look at the countries which are in the top half of the ranks of this index of economic freedom, that is the top 90 countries in the world. Beyond Mauritius, how many do you think are African? Of half the countries in the world, how many besides Mauritius do you think are in the top half? 6. Pretty good. Pretty good. Botswana at number 34, Rwanda at number 39, South Africa 77, pretty far down there, Morocco at 86, and Seychelles at 88. Again, some pretty small countries. Botswana, Seychelles, very small by population. Rwanda, smallish by population, small by size. Only South Africa, really, a largish country with a good economic record. All 4 of the large countries in Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Congo, and Nigeria, that have 1/3 of the African population are rated as moderately unfree in terms of their economy. That is, the government's intervention in the economy is to a significant degree dysfunctional. So again, even the small number of African countries that are rated as relatively good in terms of their economic performance, if you think about it in terms of the percentage of people in Africa who are in those countries, it's small. And the percentage of people in countries that are not performing well economically is relatively large. That's why if you went back to Greg's graph on per capita income and weighted it by population, that is, looked at how the average person in Africa, if you could find her, actually did, she actually does less well than the curve suggests, because the people in the large countries are doing disproportionately poorly, and the people in the small countries are doing disproportionately well. So this raises all kinds of investment issues, because as investors, you're naturally going to say, wow, I'd rather go to the large country. Big domestic market, presumably, and also has some heft in terms of the neighborhood, maybe better air links, more banks are there, perhaps a larger service sector. But one of the real problems structurally in Africa is that the large countries, which should be the first destination for a lot of foreign investors, are actually not performing well. And a bunch of small countries who you might take a look at the market and say, it's not worth it. Seychelles has less than 100,000 people. Some of the others, less than 2 million, are doing relatively well. So there's a kind of disconnect between size and performance, which affects much of how we think about in Africa. And in fact, anytime you see a statistic that talks about all African countries, remember the figure that 1/3 of the people are in 4 countries. And you really want to know what those statistics look like when you weight them by population, because you as investors are going to face a problem. Now, therefore, it's particularly important to think about sectors in Africa and which ones are relatively welcoming to foreign investment and which ones might not be. Of course, overall, it depends on the country, depends on the country's performance, and especially it depends on the government. If I were to make a few simple points about investment, I think that traditional political risk analysis probably overstates some of the dangers of investing in Africa. If your political risk assessment focuses on war, terrorism, famine, those aren't actually the risks that foreign investors should consider, because the countries that are war-torn at the moment, there aren't that many of them. They're obvious: Somalia, Central African Republic, Mali, Chad. You wouldn't be going in those as foreign investors anyhow. I think people spend too much time thinking about traditional political risk in terms of war, political upheaval. They don't spend enough time in their political risk analysis in thinking about government as a threat. Not lands, not even seizure, I'm not even talking about nationalization, but that the government of the day, especially once a bargain is struck with foreign investors, will change the rules of the game a few years later and change the profit calculus of foreign investors and make the investment less productive. That's the real risk in most African countries. That if you're a real foreign investor and you're looking at something that's going to have a payback of 5, 10, 15 years, and you're thinking, wow, maybe this project will last a quarter of a century, it's very hard to predict with certainty that the government will maintain a macroeconomic environment and a set of regulations which are the same as that you signed on to. So the real risk is from government itself. And I think that should structure how you think of sectoral risk. And then as a note, I'll also say, I think that people sometimes underestimate exchange rate risk in African countries. Because the markets for trading in a lot of these foreign currencies is very shallow, there can be sharp movements in them. Greg and I were talking about the Rand this morning, which is not such a shallow market, but has had a lot of gyrations recently. Some of the markets are very hard to understand because they're so shallow. It's very hard to hedge against the currency risk, or very, very expensive. So as an aside, I'll note it's difficult. In terms of sectoral analysis, what follows from my logic above is that I think the most problematic place to invest in most African countries now is in mining, which requires a large amount of literally sunk capital up front, where people have to invest hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in mines and associated infrastructure before really much of anything comes out of the ground. And then they try to make a profit over the next 20, 25 years. In terms of the political calculus, once that capital is sunk, once that money is in the ground, then all political power is with the government of the day. And the temptation, as we've seen in Zambia, as we've seen now in Democratic Republic of the Congo, to change the rules of the game are overwhelming, because the government knows the company can't go anywhere, because it's going to run those mines in order to get some cash back no matter what. So I think in most African countries where you're looking about a huge upfront investment in mining, it's very problematic. And some companies have to go and do that anyhow, because the oil or whatever mineral they're looking for is only in certain places. But continent-wide, we've seen a real decline in investment in hard minerals and now in hydrocarbons over the last few years, in good part because of governmental risk. There has been a lot of talk about investment in infrastructure. Greg mentioned this as an aside, but again, government policies are very problematic. There was, for instance, real enthusiasm a few years ago for public-private partnerships in water projects. Africa needs the development of a significant amount of water infrastructure. Relatively few people are served by clean water. The projects where foreign investors have invested with government and water projects have usually turned out poorly, because government is not willing to charge a commercial tariff for water. Too sensitive a political issue in many cases. So a company signs on thinking that water is going to be charged at a certain rate, then it doesn't happen. To a certain extent, this is true of electricity, although not as sensitive a political issue. There have been instances where foreign investors have done well in infrastructure. They tend to be where foreign investors come in as managers of government-owned assets, such as running airports. Those tend to be productive investments, in good part because the foreign investor doesn't have to place so much capital up front, but rather it's the personal expertise, the technical expertise that they bring to the table, and if government changes the rules of the game, they can just pull back. Manufacturing is one of the key chapters of the book. This is a critical issue for Africa because, as Greg said, you need to create about 16 million jobs a year given the enormous youth bulge that's coming on the labor market in the next 20 or 30 years. And that's going to happen no matter what. Nigeria around 2050 will have 400 million people. It'll be the third largest country in the world. After India and China, it will surpass Indonesia. The mother of the 400th million Nigerian has already been born. There's no stopping that. There may be advantages to birth control and lots of other things, but the demographic inertia is so great that it's going to happen. So manufacturing could be one of the sectors that provide a significant number of jobs. And there's also a global drama going on, obviously. As wage rates in China increase, there's a question of, well, some of the factories that are in China right now because of relatively low wages, as they become uncompetitive there, where are they going to go? And the great African hope is they'll come to Africa. Not inevitable. Indonesia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, among other places, also has a lot of people, a lot of underemployed people right now with relatively low wage rates. African wage rates in manufacturing are extremely low. If you look at how much you have to pay workers. Few exceptions, South Africa, a few countries with a minimum wage, but the wage rates are extremely low. But the economies as a whole are uncompetitive because electricity, as Greg said, is problematic. The roads are problematic. In many cases, countries have ports that don't work particularly well, or they're landlocked and have to go through their neighbors' transportation systems to get to a port. Banking systems tend to be very inefficient. So once you add up all those costs, the fact that African workers are often willing to work for a relatively low wage does not make for a particularly competitive economy at the current time. And if you look at the cost of manufacturing in most African countries, because of non-wage costs, it's not a particularly good deal. And one of the Central African challenges over the next 20 years, as all those factories that are currently in China look for someplace else to go, will be to get those non-wage costs down. And as you saw in the presentation, that's going to be difficult. Finally, services. There are lots of other sectors I could talk about, but services, I think, has tremendous potential. Tourism is a very much underdeveloped sector in most African countries. It's a great generator of jobs, which is exactly what most African countries need. African countries by themselves tend not to have the technology, the experience, and the limited amount of capital that you need to develop services. And at the same time, services are a good sector for foreign investors because they don't require usually a large deployment of capital up front, which makes you vulnerable to government. But rather, it's a limited amount of capital as well as some human expertise and technology, which frankly can be pulled out if things don't go relatively well. So we're very keen, especially on the service sector, broadly defined as an area where foreign investors can make progress in many countries and which would be highly beneficial. The bottom line, however, as the World Economic Forum noted in its Global Competitiveness Report last year, is that over the last 10 years, the African continent as a whole has not changed its competitive position vis-a-vis global economies. That has to change. African countries have to be more competitive because there's no capital except for a few mining companies that has to go to African countries. There are too many other countries, including countries in this region, that want to move ahead, that are competitive, and often have different and better business environments. And most critically, I think, African countries are going to have to reduce the risk from government itself if they are going to attract not only foreign investors, but domestic investors. So a little gloss on foreign investment from the analysis we did in the book. Let me stop there, and I know Greg and I would be happy to have a conversation with you about these important issues.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a couple of minutes.
Maybe we'll pull the chairs up and we'll just sit here.
Are there any questions from your side, please? Yolanda?
Hi, I wanted to say it's fascinating, your presentation, and I wanted to ask a question about to what extent do you think culture matters? And we're talking about cultures in terms of the impact of cultures on economic development, in terms of countries, Singapore, etc. But even within Africa, how does cultural variance impact the performance?
You've asked one of the great questions, and I'll say culture matters immensely, we just don't know how. If you look at the 1950s, very smart people in Europe and the United States were writing books like Gunnar Myrdal, Asian Drama, the Nobel Economics Prize winner, 3-volume work, arguing that Asia would not develop because Confucius orientation meant that people would not be entrepreneurial and risk takers. Turned out to be wrong, almost completely. But if you look back only 50, 60 years ago, there were all kinds of cultural arguments why Asian countries would not grow. That turned out to be wrong. And by the way, 50, 60 years ago, many people were much more optimistic about African countries, which, as Greg said, oftentimes had higher per capita incomes than Asia. In the mid-1950s, Ghana had a higher per capita income than South Korea. Haiti had a higher per capita income than Malaysia. So all those cultural arguments are wrong, were wrong. And I've also, and Greg has too, been on the side of arguing in many cases with African leaders that their culture didn't inhibit them. For instance, in the 1980s and 1990s especially, there was a big argument that African governments weren't paying their farmers a high enough price for their commodities. In many African countries, there are marketing boards which buy all of the domestic produce of farmers. And a lot of people, especially the World Bank and the IMF, said you have to raise those prices and you'll get better production. And you heard all kinds of arguments from Africa saying, no, the farmers are illiterate, they're very adverse to risk, they won't know about the price increases, they have an extended family, so if they get more money, they'll just have to spend it on their brothers and sisters. When the prices went up, production went up. It turned out that Africans were no different in terms of their economic analysis than anybody else. So I know culture matters. I've just found over and over again that when people say it matters in a particular way, that they're wrong. Do you want to?
I think in relation to strategy, I'm looking at strategy execution, not in terms of cultural differences as you know it in terms of the ethnic and gender and all the rest. But it's really about execution strategy.
I think one of the issues that makes a big, and we talk about this in the book, one of the issues that makes a big difference when it comes to execution and implementation in terms of planning is the aid environment. So what, as I mentioned briefly, what African countries have done very successfully in developing national development plans over the last 30 years is to develop those plans and do the diagnostics around what the problem sets are. So read most development plans, there's lots of problems identified, challenges in the past in terms of implementation and so on and so forth. And these are also apparent in terms of their vision documents. Where they fall down is in terms of prioritization and sequencing of reforms. And so what you get is a long listing of stuff to do. It's a sort of, school homework type essay. Lots of things to do, no prioritization. I mean, our National Development Plan in South Africa has hundreds, literally, of so-called priorities, which mean you have none at all. And then the question is, why do you have so many priorities? And I think it's partly about political choice domestically, so nobody wants to favor particular constituencies and make tough choices. And partly because if you have so many priorities, there's almost anywhere that the international donor community can slot into, because they themselves have sets of priorities. Well, if you have hundreds, well, there's inevitably going to be some sort of match between their 5 priorities and your several hundred. I think that's more of a factor in terms of translating strategy into action than perhaps questions of culture. The flip side of questions of culture often is that Africans don't have high enough rates of productivity. Now that, I think, relates a lot to education, it relates a lot to leadership. I don't think it relates to culture. I think Africans work harder for less. I mean, an African rural woman probably works harder for less than anybody in the world. It's about the context, it's about the productive environment, it's about the liberalization of their domestic environment, it's about their emancipation, it's about all sorts of other stuff. Maybe culture has a small element of that, but it's also about the changing nature of politics in these societies, about greater openness. So I think we tend to lump lots of stuff into the cultural basket, but actually a lot of it needs to be separated out.
I'll go to my question. I would say that observation with 1950 on Asia is not well placed. Probably written by economic development of Asia within the 4 wars. Asia is driven by South China, which is entrepreneur in nature. It costs more than live on the coast, survival. Japan, the same thing, is run by water. So to take Confucius as a norm for that analysis, I think is the first mistake. Number 1. Number 2, I do not use the word culture, but I may not totally agree with what you, after operating 20 years in the agro, and now in banking, insurance, just launched a fintech in Africa. Civilization. And one of the critical behavior observation, go back to civilization, get even on that. Yes, the governments, these are the follow-through effect of people, their patient, their greed, the way of government in Africa. So basically that is my point for those answers you gave. My question number 1, why was time zone, connectivity, and language not a weakness in your definition of SWOT when you put it as a plus to Eastern Europe, to Europe? I think that thinking had to change. The world had changed. What driven Africa the last 15, 20 years? Asia. Not so much on Africa. So I would think that also deter on people investing in Asia, as you see China, you see India as a trader. Now, to me as an operator there, in order to look at Africa, it's better to say continental Africa. I operate in 6 African countries, now 7. And don't be too encouraged in Mauritius. I'm there for 2 years and for a company, nothing done yet. It is different place of operation, different way of approaching each country. So it's better that we as business operator, investors, or even writer, focus on the first phase of African country that can be 70% successful, rather than lump all Africa together. So that is what I need to say, and the best I like to see in Africa as an investor operator, let the foreign culture here does not mean the civilization culture alone, it's also the management culture, the culture of connectivity to international way of living thing. Let me give you an example. As a vice chair of African Business Group, I mean, follow all the delegation. In fact, I'm the first one to bring 2006 UNDP and TICA to Singapore SBF. The first delegate Africa, we launched in Mauritius, we broadcast out of Paris. Let me tell you an observation. In every seminar you watch, Singapore African or whatever you call, when the African nation come to Singapore, African brothers don't talk to each other. So intra-Africa, pan-Africa is out of the picture. And it's politically sensitive. Number two, they never go and meet the Asian investors. So these are practical issues, rather academic and theoretical issues. If you don't reach out to people, you don't learn another culture or a way of doing business, you don't get connect. So why fly 20 hours to Singapore or to other part of Asia, when even don't say hello to your next African brother? Let me share an experience. When I speak at the World Bank, TICA, UNDP in Bonn, I use the wrong word, Africans or African brothers. Ivory Coast was standing up, Kenya was standing up. We're not brothers. I learned from that day onward. I learned from that day on. Africa is not one. So that's my point to make. Thank you.
Gentlemen, would you like to respond? Can I ask that sort of
Do you want to take a couple together? Do you want to take a couple of quick questions
Good, we do that.
Thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. My co-founder and I, we're actually from Japan, but we have a company, a technology company here in Singapore. Currently, we're providing mobile and big data technology to governments as well as companies in the tourism sector. But we are keen to expand ourselves into the African market, and we are also keen to enter medical as well as solar electricity space. But I do understand from your presentation that particularly around electricity could have some challenges for private sector. So my question is, for entrepreneurs and technology companies like us, what would be your advice for us to enter African market? Should we be seeking for partnership with the government sector, or should we be seeking for partnership with other larger foreign investors or non-governmental sectors? If you have any advice, that will be useful for us. Thank you.
Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Yeah, I just want to make a point. If you look at ASEAN or Asia, there's a lot of international trades among ourselves. And also you look at the mobilities of people, goods and services. In Asians alone, you see a lot of very active participation among all the trades. To my understanding, Africa, it adds to my point correctly, the impression is that most of the countries are isolationists, meaning that they stay on its own. So I want to know that in terms of international trades among the African nations and the people mobilities among themselves, maybe you can do a bit of measurements of Africa against Asia in that respect. Thank you.
So we hand over to
Sure.
the esteemed panel members.
I'll try and cover them.
I'll take the easy ones.
I think I agree with you 100% on the issue of differentiation. I mean, it's always with 55 countries, 54 countries, 49 in sub-Saharan Africa, there's always a danger of generalizations, which of course is the danger implicit in your question. What should we do in the tech sector? Well, where? Public, private, NGO, talking about South Africa, or are we talking about Gambia? These are two different worlds. And I remember once giving a talk in South Korea just during the time of the financial crisis in 1998, 97, 98, and that financial crisis as opposed to 10 years later. And and I said the extraordinary thing about South Korea is when I think South Korea, I think Myanmar, I think Bangladesh, I think Laos. And the audience was aghast and said, what do you mean? And I said, but it's all the same, isn't it? It's all Asia, sort of, isn't it? And I said, no, of course it's not. And I said, that's my point. Of course it's not. These are highly differentiated by size, as Jeffrey was pointing out, by economic structure, by levels of diversification and sophistication, by levels of electrification, by levels of political representation, etc., etc., etc. And which is why the general hypothesis of Africa as a hopeless continent, the economist of 2000, or Africa rising, the economist of a decade later, these are you know, very much slogans which you have to clearly dig underneath and be able to understand these very different environments. And I think if I could make a plug for the Center for African Studies here, is why such centers are hugely important as gathering places to enable that degree of granularity that is often absent in the African debate. You wouldn't want us to debate Asia as Asia rising or Asia as a hopeless region of the world, just as much as we don't want that to take place in Africa. So centers of excellence are hugely important in terms of understanding, and understanding is hugely important in terms of being able to de-risk investments, which is again what Jeffrey was talking about. If you're going to de-risk investments, that goes with two things, which Asia has understood from its own experience, which is local understanding and knowledge, which we don't have across Africa. I don't think we have good understanding in Rwanda of what's happening in Cameroon, do you? No, share skin color, and maybe a view of the outside world with regard to Africa, but very little else. And the other aspect, which is incredibly important, and I think neglected as a factor of African business, is relationships. And we are as dependent on building relationships as you are in your business environments. And those connections, that trust that comes from that level of knowledge that comes from that, is afforded by such events, but also afforded by levels of understanding in Africa. And we're no different. Why should we be in this context? But there are common features, and we've tried to pick out some of those common features for you. I agree that our geographic location, which we can't change, by the way, is a strength and a weakness, but you can't have everything in every column. Otherwise you look silly at the end of the day. Yes, and I think our orientation always towards Europe has meant that we've missed out on some opportunities. Those are changing, which is one of the reasons why we're here. But I think the most common feature of all was reminded to me yesterday, which is that African countries don't really, by and large, see the need to incentivize investors. They think that what we have is enough, and particularly what we have underneath our soil is enough. And it's almost this blank understanding about why it is that people aren't coming that most African politicians or policy makers, opinion formers, don't really get. And Asia has got the need to incentivize investment through policy, through infrastructure, through changing the conditions, local conditions in both the institutional and literally the physical setting, which I think is a big differentiation as to where we are in Africa. I think we are very isolated from each other. I think our levels of understanding, as I've already said, are very minimalist. I've just been at the African Union Summit in Ethiopia, which was an exercise in perseverance and in frustration in many respects. a good opportunity to catch up on 40 weeks. I think many African countries have quite different interests. They have real interests in their regions. They go to these multilateral gatherings with a shared view of the world outside, perhaps, but they're much less about causality in terms of their interstate relationships. And I see that there's a lot of expression of frustration, but much less in the way of action. There's very few African leaders that have really tackled regional integration in a way that reduces logistics costs, for example. The reason why we have such low volumes of regional trade is partly because we make many of the same goods which are largely unbeneficiated, and that's why we export them to external markets, but also because the internal trading conditions are so difficult. It's very hard to move around. Absence of common visas, common passports, which is on the AU's agenda now, the absence of internal flight linkages, but very hard to go from one place to the other. Just try, as I did recently, to fly from Nigeria to Liberia, which is just an hour away, is an exercise an entire day, sometimes 2 days of flying on a commercial flight. It's extremely difficult to move around. And that particularly applies to internal trade routes. And it always strikes me, some of the early work we did for your president in Rwanda was we did the first route diagnostic from Mombasa to Kigali, sitting on a truck doing time and motion studies. And in Africa, and this is for other, just general comment about Africa, not that specific route diagnostic, a third of the time is spent on the truck driving, a third of the time waiting at border posts, and a third of the time the truck drivers eating, sleeping, drinking, whatever truck drivers do. And you know, in Europe that doesn't happen. Border posts are things that you go past at 50 kilometers an hour. And we know this. We know this very well, and there's technology available today which enables us to get past these types of systems. So why do these border posts exist? And they exist because there's a lack of trust. They exist because there are sources of revenue, both nationally, but also locally. You slow down a truck, there's opportunity. You stop a truck, there's greater opportunity. You stop it for a long length of time, there's a business. And this is, you know, we are aware of this. And to reduce these internal transportation costs is a major part, I believe, of getting the African internal trade environment right. And we know this. The frustrating part is how do we make this happen? So let me just conclude by going back to saying what a pleasure it is to be here, to have informed discussions in this forum, which is so important for Singapore to have, and it puts you in a different space to the rest of your region. Jeffrey.
I'll just take the technology question. I would say you should partner with a local company. I wouldn't partner with most governments. I think I wouldn't partner with most governments anywhere in the world, frankly, but I think it's mostly governments are a risk, but I think it's very important to have people on the ground who understand the political, cultural milieu. And in many countries now, there are emergent technology sectors. You know, it's not just Silicon Valley in the United States anymore. We see in Kenya, we see in South Africa, Nigeria, some other places, some real entrepreneurs who you could partner with. So I think I would say you have to have a partner. It should not be a government. It should be a local partner. I think you may be surprised, pleasantly surprised, by some of the human talent on the ground, which has improved. I mean, all the educational statistics, Greg said, you know, point to overall education systems that haven't delivered, but there are more highly trained Africans in most countries than there were a generation ago. And it's not that expensive, you know, to play in the technology sector. It doesn't require the kind of upfront capital costs I talked about in mining. So I would say get a local partner.
So let me just add, so one of the things we did in the book was we went to the tech incubators in Kenya.
Yeah.
And we were following the slipstream of Mark Zuckerberg. who had just been to Kenya and I think somewhere else.
Nigeria.
Did he go to Rwanda? I can't remember. We went to Nigeria or wherever. And he did a sort of flying visit. And he has this idea of creating these kind of free internet areas, which then enables, in the long term, credit profiling through WhatsApp and Messenger and the like. Excuse me. And then you can build a whole business structure around this, a consumer structure and a banking structure and everything else. And the Kenyans were very cynical about this because, you know, they were going, you know, who's this guy? What's he teaching us about tech? Yes, he's wealthy, but, you know, we've got our own tech sector here. We did M-Pesa, we do all these things. And to echo and to cement Jeff's comment, you know, there's lots of bright folk in Africa who are working in this space and short-circuit the knowledge that you're going to have to build to enter this by partnering up with some of them. So understand who's regarded as the bright young things. Go back to my point, build some relationships. We're no different to other areas of the world. Build some relationships.
Kenya is called Silicon Savannah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's probably, you know, everyone has a silicon something or another. But there's lots of bright people. There may be Kenyans working in South Africa. There may be South Africans, as I discovered recently, working in Tanzania. They're all over the place. You know, some of the most tech-savvy people in the telecom space are working in places like Somaliland, given their dependence on tech to move money around. There's all sorts of people. Most of them are a good 25 years younger than me, though. And can I just say, we've possible?
Yeah.
We've done this book. I hope that you get a copy, but we have a copy that we've signed to present to the centre.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, from my side, Greg, Jeffrey, thank you so much. You've been very insightful. Africa is a wonderful place, and I'm talking about the continent as a whole. Well knowing we're talking about 54 and 49 respectively, look at the whole versus sub-Saharan Africa. It has many challenges. I tend to be an Afro-optimist, so I give the rosy side. The challenges for me frequently are business opportunities from people from abroad, people that have already invented the wheel. And I do think that Africa needs to stop reinventing this wheel and learn from other places. Implementation is always going to be a challenge. Bono Moale 2 years ago, he was then still the deputy chairman or the chairman of Shell South Africa. He ruffled a few South African feathers by saying that South Africa is brilliant at planning. They struggle somewhat at implementation. To what extent that is true in the rest of Africa remains to be seen. I can imagine there are a few, but I've also seen a couple that are actually good at implementation, and I do believe that the smaller countries are doing good in that sense. Thank you so much for your willingness to come and share your experience and the book with us. It's been very kind of you to do that, and it's highly appreciated. So thank you very much. And just as a small token of our appreciation, you can't buy this, you have to earn it. So you've got to thank you.
It's a big bar of chocolate.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, yes, thank you very much for attending the session and listening to our two guests. We have, Jeffrey spoke about tourism. On the 7th of March, we have a breakfast session again on tourism, looking at an entrepreneur opening up a tourism business in Africa and getting people from Southeast Asia into Africa via the tourism route. So please come and have some breakfast, come and meet some people and listen to what Teresa Kwong has to say. Looking forward to see as many of you there as possible. So once again, thank you for your attendance. The two authors would be around till 15:15. Unfortunately, they have a meeting at 11:45. I like 11:45. So if you would like to ask them something, you have 10 minutes left for that specific purpose. So given that, I'm going to shut up and say thank you once again.